Hi folks, in this video I would like to go over some of the main moves in the ontological argument as presented by William Rowe. First, I will present the argument as a whole, then I will break it down into its individual premises and conclusion, and then I'll offer a few objections that have been raised in the past. Keep in mind as we go along that the term God is being used in place of the longer phrase, the being than which none greater is possible. So whenever the term God appears, we are to think of it simply as an abbreviation of this longer phrase. So I'm going to say the arguments first, all the premises and the conclusion first, and then go back. So in a nutshell, premise 1, God exists in the understanding. Premise 2, God might have existed in reality. Number 3, if something exists only in the understanding and might have existed in reality, then it might have been greater than it is. Premise 4, suppose God exists only in the understanding. Premise 5, God might have been greater than he is. Premise 6, God is a being than which a greater is possible. Premise 7, the being then which none greater is possible is a being than which a greater is possible. Premise 8, it is false that God exists only in the understanding. And finally, the conclusion, God exists in reality as well as in the understanding. So, taking these one by one, premise 1 is simply an acknowledgement that if one accepts the proposed definition of God, one must admit that God does indeed exist in the understanding, meaning that one can think of God according to the definition. Okay, fine. Premise 2 says that God could have existed in reality, that God is a possible being. Premise 3 states that if something exists only in the mind, it actually could have been greater had it existed in reality as well. Now, it might appear to one that there are some things like wars or diseases that it would be better if they only existed only in the mind and not in reality. But especially when talking about good things like God, it seems pretty reasonable to go ahead and admit that existing in reality is better than existing only in the mind, at least for good things. So for the sake of argument, you might say, it's probably good to just accept this premise. Of course, in analyzing arguments, there's two ways to analyze an argument. There's two important things in arguments, and actually two only. Are the premises true, and do the premises support the conclusion? Okay, those two things. So if one wanted to argue that premise 3 was false, that would be an objection there. The problem with the argument, though, has sometimes been seen in other places than in premise 3. Now, the force of the argument is in these 3 premises. The next 4 premises are designed to show that an absurd result will occur if God is thought to exist only in the understanding. Let's go a little faster. Okay. Looking at premises 4 through 8, what is being said here is that if God only existed in the understanding, I'm just going to summarize what's being said. So suppose God exists only in the understanding. So 4 through 8 is kind of a supposition. So it shows the absurdity of imagining that God could keep his definition and yet exist only in the understanding. So summarizing these, what's being said here is that if God only existed in the understanding, then a greater being than God would be possible. But if so, God would then not be God, and so that leads to absurdity. God would not be God because, remember, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, or the being than which nothing greater is possible. So you would have a situation where something greater would be possible if God only existed in the understanding. That is, God might have existed in reality, and that would be greater since we accepted premise 3. The way that Rowe says it is that these four premises establish that no non-existing thing could be God. Okay? By a non-existing thing, he means a thing that exists only in the mind and not in reality. But it appears that with these four premises, again, no non-existing thing could be God. So again, remember the first definition, or the definition is that God is that than which nothing greater is possible. So if you have God existing only in the understanding, something greater is possible. So if you think of God existing in the understanding alone as being a non-existent thing, okay, like a unicorn that exists only in the mind, or maybe the Loch Ness Monster, or Bigfoot, or something like that. Those things exist only in the understanding, presumably, and so those things don't exist. So what this whole 4 through 8, these premises establish, is that no non-existing thing could be God. Okay? Now, premise 9 is the conclusion, and claims that God therefore exists. That is, premise 9 claims that God, on the basis of the preceding premises, must exist. So God must exist. Okay? This argument has been very popular for many centuries, and it's easy to see why. By starting out with very innocent premises, it appears that if one accepts the definition of God, one is led to the realization that God must exist. Now, Rowe argues that the argument is question-begging. An argument begs the question if the claim in the conclusion is stated by one or more of the premises, so that when one accepts the premises, one is already accepting the conclusion as well. By the way, many people outside of philosophy use the term begging the question to mean something like raises the question or makes one think of a question, instead of in the way that it is used properly in logic, which means, again, that what's being argued for is already sort of hiding in the premises. Rowe's criticism of the argument centers around the second premise. So let's go back up to that. Okay. Oh, okay, I'm going the wrong way. Okay. Back in the second premise. Okay. A possible being in logic. So the second premise is asking one to accept, is it possible that God could exist? So a possible being in logic is one that either exists or doesn't exist. Okay? One of the two. It's possible it could exist or not exist. Once one accepts that God is a possible being, the argument then goes on to apparently show that God cannot be a non-existent being. At that point, the only option left is that God is an existing being. Rowe's explanation of this is interesting, if a little bit difficult to grasp the first time one reads through it. So again, if we are being asked to accept that God is a possible being in premise 2, that apparently brings up only two possibilities. God either exists or God doesn't exist. But what Rowe is arguing here is what happens next in the argument with the next few premises is that it is claimed in a way that seems acceptable at the, one by one as the premises go by. It seems that it could not be possible that God doesn't exist. So that would only leave existence as a possibility. However, there may be an even simpler way to think about what goes wrong with the ontological argument. In the very first premise, we are asked to accept that God exists in the understanding. Now, there's a bit of equivocation here. This is another argument fallacy, which means that a word is being used in two different senses in the same argument. So God exists in the understanding versus God in the second premise, okay? The way God is being used in the first premise and the way God is being used in the second premise are different, okay? By saying that God exists in the understanding, what the reader thinks they're being asked to accept is that the concept of God exists in the understanding, not God himself. It would seem kind of strange to say that God actually exists in the understanding, especially since the argument is supposed to prove that God exists. So what the reader appears to be accepting there is just the innocuous, benign premise that one can conceive of God. One can certainly conceive of God, maybe in an imperfect way and all that, but generally it's pretty easy to accept the first premise. Accepting this seems reasonable enough, but then the argument goes on to refer to God, not just the concept of God. So, for instance, there in the second premise, we go from what presumably means the concept of God exists in the understanding, because that's what exists in the understanding. And I hope I don't need to explain what the understanding means. It's just, the way somebody understands. This is how they used the mind sometimes, the term the mind in those days. So I think it has a sort of intuitive clearness about that. All we need anyway. So in the second premise, though, it shifts from the concept of God to God, okay? So it appears that one is logically bound to accept that God must exist in reality in order to stay consistent with the definition. That is, from 2 all the way down to 8, it appears that we have to accept what comes next because we accepted number 1. So the equivocation comes with the use of God to mean a concept in premise 1 and then to mean the entity, God himself, in premise 2. So an honest interpretation of the argument, so the objection goes, would seem to be this: accept that the concept of God exists in the understanding, then go on and accept that by the definition, God, if he exists, would have to exist in reality as well, okay? So God might have existed in reality, so God is a possible being. And if something exists in the understanding, it might have existed in reality, and so on. What the argument then actually proves is that if there's a God, God must exist in reality just by definition, okay? So when we get to the end of the argument, in other words, the argument succeeds in proving that a God defined as the being than which nothing greater is possible would have to actually exist if God actually exists, okay? So what we get here, since 2 through 8 are talking about the entity God, and we can accept all of these, so it is false, it would be false to say that God exists only in the understanding. Then what we get in 9 in an honest account, so the objection goes, we'd have to add the words, if he exists, if God exists in reality as well as in the understanding. Okay, so it turns out to be a little bit circular according to this objection. Now, this is one of the harder arguments to comprehend in philosophy, but it has been found to be very interesting to many people for a long time. I hope this video helps you to understand this challenging train of reasoning. Of course, you will need to do the reasoning yourself, going through the steps slowly. I highly suggest printing out all the readings as you come to them, and make notes in pencil or pen as your taste runs, to help you work through and make notes on the readings. I hope that this video has helped you understand it. So thank you for your time and attention. Of course, if there's any questions at all, be sure and let me know. Thank you for listening.